Hello and good morning. It's 10 o'clock sharp in London. Welcome to our lovely Pinot Noir masterclass featuring New Zealand and Australia. So, Peter, why don't you say hello and introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. Can I first say congratulations to Anne, who got engaged over the weekend. So, cheers, Anne.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'd like to start by saying, obviously, I'm a Kiwi. I've lived outside the country for 30 years. So I guess I take a proprietal but critical view of New Zealand wine. As for Australia, half my family lived there. But to be honest, I have to admit that Australia and New Zealand have a slightly sort of big brother, little brother relationship. New Zealand obviously being a little brother and feeling a bit patronized sometimes and being a bit uppity at the same time as well. However, my professional life involves judging wines, assessing wines. I judge competitions. I recommend and select wines for clients. So I think I'm pretty objective. I once had a client who commented on a new wine and said, there's rather a lot of New Zealand wines on it. I said, that's because they're good, not because I'm patriotic. And I would genuinely argue that. Now, having said that, we all have biases, and I think it's important to acknowledge your biases. When it comes to Pinot Noir, I want flesh and I want perfume. Now, these days, we have to be careful about dodgy terms. So I definitely don't talk about masculine and feminine in the context of wine. I think it's rubbish anyway, but we don't do that. I have to admit to a prejudice, which I recognise is wrong, and that's that Australia's too hot for Pinot. And I think you're going to find today, obviously, it's not. So actually, to avoid my own sort of subtle bias, I tasted these wines blind in pairs before we started, just to see what would happen. And as we all know, blind tasting is humbling. So I might share some thoughts on that in a moment. I should also say, in my experience, I judged in Hobart once, the Royal Hobart Wine Show, which is a fantastic show chaired by the late, great Tony Jordan. And we were judging a class of Pinot Noirs, and Hobart's one of the few Australian national shows that lets New Zealand in. And there was one Pinot, and I said, gold medal. And all the Australian judges said, nah, mate, it's green. I said, no, it's not green, it's herbaceous. And that's a fine distinction I'd like to make. So no one, I wouldn't back down, and neither would they. So the chairman, Dr. Jordan, was called, and he sort of tasted this wine. He went, he said, this is going to come back and bite me on the ass. But Peter's right, it's great. And it went on and won the trophy for best Pinot Noir. And I wasn't choosing it because it was from New Zealand, but it turned out to be from New Zealand. Now, the interesting thing is, after the judging, a very well-known Tasmanian winemaker came along to taste all the wines, and he said, what's all this with New Zealand winning all these trophies? And then he said, well, if they're winning trophies, we've got to see what they're doing and see why. And I thought that was a really healthy attitude. And I think, in fact, that's exact kind of attitude, which means we're seeing some fantastic Pinot Noirs from Australia. Okay, Anne, back to you.
Well, I just thank you, Peter, for being so honest and for also just explaining that relationship, which I actually think is it's a wonderfully friendly rivalry, but I think there's actual real thought exchange. And because we discussed a lot of this before, I just stole Peter's idea of blind tasting them. And last night I blind tasted all of these wines, not in pairs, completely random order. And it was very instructive. And I know that some people want to tie things down. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could always just taste origin and sort of sniff and taste and say, I can nail this? What I thought last night, as I tasted them completely and utterly blind, I thought, that is a really difficult undertaking. However, once you then connect the dots and know where these things are from, certain things, we can then absolutely connect climate and climate and how it tastes in the wine, or topography, or soil, or winemaking. So you can sometimes, we always as humans look for a causal connection between cause and effect, especially in wine. We think we taste this, what is the cause? And when wine itself is an endless matrix of numerous variables, which are so hard. So connecting those kind of cause and effect is difficult in wine. There are almost no straight lines in that. But I think this will be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to tasting with you now. We also have some housekeeping points. If you see me staring over there all the time, it's because I have another screen here which tells me what I actually have to say and do. So first of all, we have 1.5 hours for this webinar. We have 8 wines. Peter and I will just taste them together and bounce off each other and hopefully impart information as well. I know that not all of you, and I see we have a whole wonderfully huge European audience, which just fills my heart with joy. I see Aberdeen, Stockholm, Stuttgart, and Finland, and it's just wonderful. So welcome everybody. And there are Q&A and chat functions, and we keep an eye on the chat, but we would ask you to post the questions in there because you can't talk to us. Then we've had pre-supplied questions, which are rather technical, and I'm happy to, I don't know who posted them. I was told it's a series of questions all posted by one MW student. I think there are some valid questions here. Please feel free to email or to get in touch. We can discuss this later, but I think some of those questions that are in there will actually be answered in the course of the webinar. Then you have a beautiful booklet, and those of you who have samples are the lucky ones. This will be very instructive. And this webinar will also be recorded, so it can be made available later. That means you can actually focus now on participating, on listening without frantically taking notes, because you can still watch it later. So, shall we kick this off, Peter?
Yes, we will. Okay. So let me address the first 2 pairs. So this was the beginning of my humbling. When I tasted them blind, first of all, I thought this one, it had number one, had a slightly more evolved color than maybe I'd expect. Particularly now that when I know what it is, it's only 18 months old. I thought I picked up a very slight note of herbaceousness, and yet it was also ripe, and there's a little bit of savouriness and sweet spice, and I picked up at that again today, so I'm pleased with myself for there. Sort of medium-bodied. There's a nice sort of sweet fruit character, quite appealing. A little bit of power, a little bit of slight dryness. I thought pretty authentic Pinot Noir. Definitely New World origin, but I wasn't necessarily sure which country it came from. Obviously, this one's from Yarra Valley. It's a superstar vintage 2021 in the Yarra. Tasting it today, maybe I picked up a bit more black fruit than red fruit than I did the other day. Again, that floral savoury spice, some power and a really nice delicacy about this. Now, of course, Yarra is just east of Melbourne. It's one of the largest regions outside of Murray-Darling Swan Hill in Australia. There's nearly 3,000 hectares of vines, and there's quite a lot of Pinot. In fact, Pinot Noir is the most widely planted grape there. We're 50 kilometers from the ocean. This is something I think we'll probably comment on with all of these wines, because by definition, pretty much everywhere in New Zealand is near the coast. And in the case of Australia, to find vineyards that are cool enough for Pinot tend to have a pretty strong oceanic influence. So we'll run through that. I guess it's worth knowing as well, this had a 3-day cold soak before fermentation. It had 40% whole bunch, which I think is about the most whole bunch in any of these wines today. Fermented with indigenous yeasts and given 8 months in French oak, of which only 10% was new. And already there, I think we're going to find that maybe compared to the cliche of maybe a few years ago, there's a lot less new oak in these wines, and probably not so long in barrel. Most of them are less than 12 months, but we'll see. Moving on to number 2. This, I thought it was interesting. My first impression of this, the Waipara West, was that it was maybe from a riper vintage, or maybe a warmer country, in fact. It was sort of sweet fruit and spice, some balsamic herbs, sort of tending towards woodiness. And I wondered if I picked up a taste of mushroom, but since I had a mushroom risotto on the go in the background in my kitchen, and but it does have a bit of age. This is nearly 4 years old. But I think maybe that mushroom was sort of in my kitchen, not actually in the glass. There's a nice sort of immediate, almost assertive bite of acidity when you taste this. Red cherry fruit, maybe a bit of cranberry, a little bit of warmth. It's 14% alcohol. And I ended up getting this as a kiwi, but thinking it was from a riper vintage. Now, it's worth talking about Waipara. Waipara is in North Canterbury. It's close to where I grew up as a kid. And it's an area that's, I think, slightly underperformed until relatively recently. We had expectations that they should be able to make good Pinot Noir. And it's really only the last few years that we're beginning to see it. And it's an area it's relatively small. It's close to the coast. Let me see. It is 14. This vineyard is 14 kilometers from the sea.
Thanks for the slide. I completely forgot about the slides. Let's move. So first of all, here we have the regions. Sorry to interrupt, but let's.
No, that's fine. It's a good point.
And here's the Yarra. We see that it is, compared to the others, relatively inland, but now the giant steps, beautiful, beautiful. And here now we are in North Canterbury. Sorry.
No, that's a good intervention, actually, I have to say. Okay, so Waipara, I have to admit, I know the family who own Waipara West. I've known them for years. This wine actually has another label in many markets called Bone Line, so you won't always find Waipara West. Waipara, by the way, is a Maori word. Wai in Maori is water, so Waipara means muddy waters. So because the river was muddy, simple as that. What you get, there's two important winds in Waipara. One is an easterly, which comes off the sea and is cold or cooling, and so you can see on that map just north of Banks Peninsula. There you can see up there. There's a range up in the top right. There's a range of hills called the Teviotdale, and they tend to protect the vineyards from the worst of that cool sea breeze. But what comes down in the summer from the northwest is a wind called a nor'wester, and it's a classic fern wind. So the wind comes from the west across the Tasman Sea. It hits the Southern Alps, rises rapidly, drops all its water on the west side where it rains a lot. And the east coast of the South Island is mostly rain shadow, so it's pretty dry. And then when the foehn blows, this nor'wester, it's hot and dry. So this particular vintage, it blew quite a lot. It was a pretty warm vintage. So I'm proud of my blind tasting ability there to pick that up. But I think what's interesting here is you see maybe two wines I think that are both interesting and good, but don't necessarily shout about regional origin. Anne, what do you think?
It is funny because when I tasted the giant steps, I started saying there's the slightest edge of unripeness. There's not that plush ripeness that you would expect, and but I must say there is also a crunch, a tannic crunch, and so that led me because first of all, Yarra Valley. This vineyard or giant steps was started 25 years back in 1997. And Phil Sexton, who founded this, was one of the pioneers of the region. So we're talking about two countries that, in the case of Australia, have made wine for a long time. There's also early incidents of winemaking in New Zealand. However, what we witness here, I think, is very much a story of the past 3 decades, of the past 30 years. And I think, considering that, what we're tasting is outstanding. I just must say that. And then when Phil Sexton went there, he went actually to the Yarra Valley in order to look for altitude, age, soils, slopes, regular rainfall, and cool nights. And so I thought, okay, we've also got this statement about 2021 beginning as a challenging vintage due to summer and autumn rains and cooler than average temperatures. So this giant steps general estate, Yarra Valley Vineyard, is actually from the Sexton, the Applejack, Primavera, Wombat Creek, Bastard Hill, and Tarraford vineyards. And if you look, many of them are actually super high altitude. Tarraford is only at 100 meters. However, Bastard Hill goes up to 400, Wombat Creek to 410, Primavera up to 240, Applejack up to 320. And I think what we can taste here is topography. And it's this kind of the fact that altitude, because how do you moderate in a continent that, apart from Tasmania, is actually a warm and also a hot climate? How do you moderate for that? You moderate either by latitude, by proximity to the ocean, or by altitude. And I think this is what you're tasting here. And I think it's also instructive to know that this is the estate stuff, because when I taste Applejack and Primavera, they're in a very different league. So I love the fact that we know where this comes from, and that you actually now can make a connection between what's in the glass and the origin, especially the topography. And when I say topography, another thing that is really interesting here is that these are very sloping vineyards. So you have very good drainage and you have that altitude. And I think that really can be tasted in here. And it's actually, for a warm climate, a very delicate wine, and one that does not shout Australia either.
Actually, Anne, if I can just butt in
please.
there, I always think about Melbourne as being on the east coast of Australia, but when you look at the map, it's facing more or less south, and it's pretty cold, that water down there in Bass Strait in the Southern Ocean. And we're not that, we're 50 kilometers from the sea here. So there's definitely an oceanic influence here that actually brings down. I mean, yes, it does get quite warm there, but there's definitely still an oceanic influence here that I think you can taste.
No question at all. And I'm not saying that all of Australia is hot. It's just, to me, very instructive to have that combination of altitude, and that for somebody really to seek out that altitude and to get those slopes, and to do that with absolute intent. And of course, they've been at it now for a quarter of a century. And I love this. And interestingly, some of the grapes are just as old, and some of the, sorry, not the grapes, the vines are even older. Some of them have been planted in the late 80s. So you have fairly old vines. And I think what I like about it is that spice on the finish. And now, when we get to Waipara West, this is 14 kilometers from the ocean, 160 meters altitude. And then when people talk about Canterbury, they often talk about, limestone outcrops. But here we actually have, decomposed greybucket and schist with some calcium. And I must say, when I tasted this blind, I stuck it into Martinborough. And shall I tell you why? Because of that gorgeous white pepper that shimmers everywhere. And there is lovely freshness. And there is vivid cherry. So as Peter described, that kind of, okay, you can taste sunshine, but you can also taste, something that is actually really brisk and fresh. And I love it when I have this kind of lovely little pepperiness. And sometimes also, I often describe it as white pepper. Now comes an even more weird tasting note. And those of you who have gardens might know it. If you have a rose hedge and then it rains on that rose hedge, there is a smell that is almost peppery and really savory. And it is a green smell that isn't unripe, that is just really totally savory. And I think this has it in spades. And the other thing that I wrote down about this wine is that there is somehow an innate balance. And what does that tell us? It tells us that Pinot feels at home where it is there. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things about Pinot, that it is a bit like Peter and myself. We can pack our bags and go somewhere else and make a wonderful home and put roots down and channel that place, because we know that there are grapes that travel, and then there are other grapes that don't travel. And Pinot definitely is a traveler. And so I love that. The other thing I wanted to say is that we have a very gentle sloping here. You see the picture. So this almost looks flat. However, it's the decomposed soils underneath and that excellent drainage that also makes a difference here. Because we know that Pinot likes to have, like the French say, le pied chaud, warm feet, you know, but needs warm feet. So well-drained soils are wonderful. But then, you know, we have that wonderful influence of that warm föhn and that cool ocean breeze. And I think they both come together here and actually create something of a beautiful contrast that I find exciting and delicious. Oh, and these grapes were planted in 1989. Sorry, the vines were planted in 1989. Shall we have a quick look at any questions in the chat? No, there are no questions. We can always look at questions later, but hang on. Shall we move on to...
Oh, there's a question there.
Oh, there is? Does it only need warm feet in a cooler climate? No, I don't think so. I think it just likes warm feet. But then it's also a bit like the English themselves. Permit me to say this, Simon, and I know you asked this with a twinkle in your eye. It's like it gets over 25 degrees here in London, and you know you have news stories how to stay cool at night at like 25 degrees. This was the first year we had a heat wave here, 40 degrees, then it was really hot. But most of the years it's not very hot here. And Pinot is like the English, doesn't like that heat, loves to have sunniness, absolute beautiful bright sunshine, but not heat. And I think the stuff about the roots is, you know, is more about drainage than it is about temperature. Would you agree, Peter?
Yes, I think that's right. I think drainage is really important. In fact, I'm just gonna push on though, because I've just seen another question about fruit from Suzuna. Why do winemakers use indigenous yeast? I would say winemakers use indigenous yeast partly because they see it, maybe not necessarily correctly, but they can see it as an expression of terroir. The truth is that if you use indigenous yeast, or you try and use indigenous yeast in a cellar where you've used cultivated yeasts, the cultivated yeast population is going to be your dominant wild population. Having said that, I know, for example, in Waipara, one producer puts a fermenter, puts a tub into the vineyard to get the ferment to start with the native indigenous yeast. So there's that. But the reason I think people do it as well, apart from maybe the idea of expressing terroir, is because it's a slower ferment. It's a less manageable ferment, arguably. Maybe it's a little bit more risky. But the combination of maybe having slightly different yeast populations during the course of the ferment in dominance and that slower thing means I think you aim to get more complexity, and that would be the most obvious thing, I think, more complexity.
And the other thing to say about why does anybody use indigenous yeast? I think because they can. Because I think anybody who has seen real life in a winery and who has seen some shitty food come in, cultured yeast will do that for you. You know, even kind of unclean fruit, certain cultured yeast will power through that. If you use only indigenous yeast, you're also making a quality statement about the status or the state of your fruit as it comes into the winery, because it has to be clean, it has to be healthy, it has to be well sorted. You can't just speed harvest your Pinot. You need to look at every bunch, etc. So I think it's also a statement of quality. They use indigenous yeast because they can, because their fruit is clean and beautiful. And Simon says he thinks of indigenous versus cultured yeast as live performance versus recorded. Okay. So
the only problem with that, Simon, is if the engineer gets the mic levels bad or poor and you can't hear the vocalist, but we won't go there. And shall we hit the second pair?
Yes, and I must say, what is really striking about this Ashton Hills vineyard is its gorgeous perfume. So I'm a total sucker for fragrant Pinot, and this is just beautiful. And again, we have high altitude. Again, we have wine from a pioneer, this time Stephen George, who this vineyard, Ashton Hills, was founded in 1982. It's dry farmed. And what I love about this is that we have fruit and spice in equal measure. We have kind of a red cherry crunch and a backbone of acid. And again, sometimes when I was sitting exams, always a telltale sign of Australia would have been eucalypt. That's not here, sadly. They make it very hard for us. But I must say, this is quite a charmer with its perfume. And so you have that, but then you also have actual proper structure. And I love that. And now I love actually when I realized, because I didn't blind taste these wines in any order, it was completely random. So it was only later on that I realized that Palliser from Martinborough had been sort of juxtaposed here with the Ashton Hills. And I think that was an inspired juxtaposition because you got spice in both. And I wrote down about Palliser, again, super free draining soils, only 40 meters altitude, 35 kilometers from Palliser Bay. And so you have, in true Martinborough fashion, you have here more savoriness than fruit initially, subtle smoke. And I think here also oaky perfumes with smoke and a bit of toastiness. And I must say, I wrote there is a tingling freshness. There's something beautifully subtle about that. And again, we don't have that much oak here. Hang on. Like pressed to French oak barrels left to mature for a period of 10 months. But I don't think there is a lot of new oak. And I think that is beautiful. And I think, just one more point, Peter, before I let you come in again. This is something we have seen not only in Australia and New Zealand, but across the world, that wherever winemakers are, they have really dialed back the oak. So on the one hand, we have this sea change where we went from like super extracted, powerful wines to far more gentle and tender wines. And because people are trying to express place, so they've taken those layers of makeup, of super ripeness and of super oak away. And so we have kind of fresh-faced, almost naked wines that show us really that allow the wine to actually show its origin, which I think was harder before. And I love that movement. I welcome it. And I think Pinot has been leading the charge for this, because the other beautiful thing is all of these wines, all of them, whether they're of lighter or of darker hue, they are translucent. Just to do, of course, a lot to do with Pinot, but we've all seen Pinots that were made to look like ink. And I love that nobody has done that here. And I must say, I love this savory and very sexy and fragrant pear here. Is it easy to tell where they're from? Not at all.
It was interesting here what Anne was just saying about oak. She may be familiar with the phrase lipstick on a pig. And I think there is the idea, I think sometimes that, wines, particularly something like Pinot, if you slam it into new oak, it is a bit like putting lipstick on a pig. What's the point? It's obvious. It's jarring. It doesn't work. And so I totally agree. Most of these wines where there's oak, well, they're all in oak, but the oak is mostly seasoned, and if there is a percentage of new oak, it's pretty small. Roy just asks, Anne was talking about altitude, and how does altitude affect Pinot grapes? It's simply a cooling effect. So I think for every 100 meters you go up, in theory, you drop a degree in average temperature. So it's as simple as that. Pinot Noir has been called the Goldilocks grape. Doesn't like it to be too hot, doesn't like it to be too cold. It likes it to be just right. And so I think that's why altitude can be as important as distance from the sea in this case. Most of these wines don't have a lot of it. I think this is one that really where altitude matters. I think for the others, it's more about oceanic influence. It was interesting when Anne said, no eucalyptus and mint. When I first tasted this, I wrote, very slight hint of eucalyptus stroke mint. Is it really there? Is it really there? And maybe it's the poverty of my language and imagination, but maybe there's something a little bit maybe dried herb there that's sort of tricking into that. It was quite interesting because this was quite pale. I'm talking the Ashton Hills here, and I thought when I tasted it, I thought, oh, it's quite primary, quite youthful, and I said, is it a bit insubstantial? And then I thought, or is that just delicacy and youth? And I think tasting it again today, it is just that it is quite a young wine, and there is some delicacy, and it's heaven forbid that a New Zealander could say that Australians could be delicate, but there you go. And again, when I first tasted it, I almost thought the flavors were almost more Grenache than Pinot. And that's not an insult, I should say, because I think some of the most exciting Grenache and Garnacha being made today, particularly in Spain, people will say, oh, it's kind of like the Pinot Noir style of Grenache. So it's definitely red fruit, but clearly this wine doesn't have the heft that Grenache has. But that was sort of my first impression. Tasting it again today, I found almost a slightly Italianate note. Really nice ripeness and really lovely delicate perfumes that develop in the glass. So maybe the first time I tasted it, I didn't give it enough time, but definitely there's more perfume coming in the glass. And again, today the fruit seems slightly darker in flavor. Worth pointing out, Piccadilly Valley, which is in the Adelaide Hills. So the Adelaide Hills is an interesting area because people think about it as being depending on who you're talking to, people say it's a cool climate region in Australia. Other people say, well, actually, it's not as cool as you think. And it really depends where you are in the whole Adelaide Hills. Generally speaking, we can say it's cool, but parts of it are relatively warm. And what's interesting in the Piccadilly Valley, they tend to plant Pinot for table wine in the warmer sites, relatively speaking, and the cooler sites, they'll have Pinot that maybe goes into sparkling base. So I think Anne talked about altitude. Just one thing that's worth mentioning, there's a very famous vineyard called Tiers, Tiers, which I think was probably planted by Brian Crozer at Petaluma. Certainly that was a wine they used. That's at 450 meters in the south of the Piccadilly Valley. And the average over the last 30 years, they found the average heat summation was similar to most of the Tasmanian viticultural areas. So even though I think that Piccadilly Valley is probably the warmest site in the Australian lineup today, we don't want to push that one too far. On to the Palliser. A friend of mine who's a winemaker in New Zealand always thought that Palliser was the most, that Martinborough was the most exciting region. For me, there was a darker fruit here, maybe riper, and maybe it was Pavlov's dog, because when I was checking my notes, Black Doris plum is considered to be an absolutely characteristic aroma flavor in Martinborough Pinot, and I did find some of that today. But there's definitely a little bit of subtle spice, maybe some dried herb, some savory elements. I'm pleased to tell you, when I was doing these blind, I did think this was the kiwi, so I think I can keep my passport now. I see that Rebecca Gibb has commented, increasing number of New Zealand Pinot producers using low toast barrels while keeping the oak at 20 to 30% new. Absolutely spot on, I think, Rebecca. Thanks for that. I think that really is that is the case. Yeah, people are mostly over new oak, which is good, I think.
Totally, and just it's part of that dialing back where you are after texture rather than flavor from oak, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So, and somebody had Palliser at their wedding. Wonderful. I think that's great. And of course, Simon says larger oak too, just to change that ratio from wine to vessel. all of this is part of that same movement to let the fruit speak more than the winemaking, and I love that. And as Peter just mentioned, Grenache, and of course Grenache, especially a beautiful Australian old vine Grenache, absolutely lends itself to being treated like a Pinot. But we also know what people can do when they treat Syrah, in a kind of gentler Pinot way. And I think this is a real huge change that has happened across the wine world. That it took quite a lot of tasting and quite a lot of big wines for people to realize that there is beauty in subtlety. It doesn't have to be a trumpet all the time. It can be a harp, and or a gentle flute. So likening the experience of tasting and drinking to hearing sounds. There are more delicate things. But isn't it interesting how many winemakers say, "Oh, I tried a Pinot approach with this." In fact, last week I tasted a Malbec made in a Pinot way, and I must say these wines charm me just because I like high acid, more tender wines that have a tannic crunch rather than a tannic, and I also realized, and this actually is very fitting right here. The Ashton Hills Vineyard says the food match is grilled steak with chimichurri sauce. And yes, boys and girls, Pinot Noir with steak is wonderful. You do not have to have Cabernet Sauvignon or Malbec or some kind of big killer wine. You can have delicate Pinot and it really works. And what is the trend of using oak in Pinot from New Zealand and Australia? Gracias. We just spoke about these trends, that it is lighter toast, fewer new barrels, different formats of oak, sometimes even as big as Foudre with 2,400 or even, more than 4,000 liters. But you also have 500 to 600 liter barrels rather than always 225 or 228. And all of that makes a difference. And all of that just allows the fruit and the wine itself to speak louder than the oak, which to me, that was just wonderful. So,
just on that question, I think about maybe people not having to try so hard, or foot off the pedal. A friend of mine who's a winemaker in New Zealand did a 10-year vertical of a vineyard, and he said, after 10 years, you realize you don't have to try so hard. You don't have to try and extract everything out of the grapes. When you've got a bit of vine age, you can let the vines speak for themselves. He said, you can ease off the extraction. And he said, you start to taste vineyard character. So he had several plots, and he said there were two that had exactly the same mixture of clones in them. But he said after 10 years, you could taste this plot versus that plot. So I think again, people are, winemakers who make Pinot Noir tend to be quite obsessive, is probably a bit strong, but I think they're looking, they're questing, they're trying to do something better. And I think a lot of winemakers in the New World have realized that less is more. Certainly in New Zealand, I suspect in Australia, I think fruit quality is almost a given. And now the answer is to say, okay, we've got that. We don't have to try so hard. Let's just step back a bit and maybe try and get it. And you mentioned texture, and I think that's really, really important. I think that makes a huge difference. I see a question from Hannah about agreeing on the rich dark fruit of the Palliser. Could it be confused with Central Otago? And are there other characters? I think the truth is that we've got to be a little bit careful about talking about definitive regional characteristics. I mean, we can talk in generalities. Someone once said to me, and they were not being nice, that Central Otago Pinot Noir was the gin and tonic of wines. Oh no, so they said it was the red equivalent of Sauvignon Blanc, and they thought that Sauvignon Blanc was the gin and tonic of wines. And so there is that idea maybe that Central Otago is very aromatic, very in your face, perhaps lacking subtlety. I think that's a little bit of a caricature. I think there is sub-regional diversity in central Otago. You have areas like Bannockburn and Bendigo that are relatively warm, and you have areas like Wanaka and Pisa Range, which are arguably cooler, and Gibbston definitely, which are arguably cooler. So yes, you could say that in general, Central Otago Pinot is aromatic and you're getting dark fruit, but it's never that straightforward, I think. Okay, should we do the next pair?
Yes, and how exciting to have Marlborough, because I think Marlborough has a lot to offer in terms of Pinot Noir. And of course, I don't know how, but I wanted to say there was an interesting question earlier by Frankie. She said, is it fair to say that Pinot is, let me scroll up. Is it fair to say that Pinot Noir is a terroir transparent grape like Riesling? So, of course it is. And I think that is why people become so obsessed with Pinot Noir. And if we look at the history of Pinot Noir if we look at the history of Burgundy, we know where site-specific viticulture was invented, where this idea of linking wine to place was born. Why was it born there? Because it was a feudal system. People worked with devotion rather than for money, because they were all monastic or church settlements. And so their view was a very different aim. Their aim was salvation and devotion, because doing that work in the vineyard and in the cellar was actually worshipping God. Very different kind of spiritual place to be. And therefore, so much dedication and so much observation, where people started, this entire feudal system enabled people not to have a field blend, but which was common and which was the standard at the time, but to actually have single varietal wine, whatever Pinot Noir was at this stage, because nobody really knows Noirien, blah blah. It was definitely either Pinot Noir or a direct precursor. So Pinot Noir is spoken of as a very, very terroir transparent grape, and I do not like to use the term terroir because it's so loaded, as a very site-specific grape. And so, of course, is Riesling. And site-specific viticulture, you see, is always a very, very important matter in cooler zones. Why? Because in cooler zones, it was very important where you planted, so your grapes would ripen. Yeah? And those things are true for Pinot and for Riesling. And when you speak to winemakers who make both Riesling and Pinot Noir, they say they are the two different faces of that same coin of trying to express site. So I definitely think this is very much the case. But of course, we must also be very aware of that history and how long that beautiful, mystical narrative of Pinot Noir has had to, to shimmer in all kind of cultures, and now everybody tries to do that just because it is Pinot Noir. And I must say they're succeeding beautifully, because we can taste things that are site specific, as hard as it is to taste them blind and then point them there. Sorry. And now, if we look at Dog Point Marlborough, Marlborough is of course the great success story, the success story of New World wine. So there was first Australian Chardonnay, Sunshine in a Glass, and then there was, oh my God, so much flavor from Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough. And now it's become a kind of, oh my God, Marlborough is all about Sauvignon Blanc. But now that people actually really know so much more about their soils, there are gorgeous pockets for Pinot in Marlborough that I am very excited about. And this is vis-a-vis a wine from Tassie. And when I saw that Stargazer was in that lineup, my heart skipped a little beat, because I am a fan of Stargazer. And this is a single vineyard wine, Palisander vineyard. So we have in the Palisander vineyard from Stargazer, we have igneous rock, meaning of volcanic origin. And then in Marlborough, we have dried out old riverbeds, and both very well drained. We have silty clay loams here in Dog Point, and again the Sutherland family of Dog Point, total pioneers in Marlborough, planting as early as the 70s, being instrumental in the development of Cloudy Bay, and then deciding in 2002 to get their own label, and now they're an amazing name. I must say that in my blind tasting, Dog Point, the Dog Point Pinot, for me was the weakest wine, because it's sort of, I wanted more from it. I wanted more. And here we have actually one of the highest proportions of new oak, like 30% new. And I wonder whether this just hasn't blossomed yet, or whether there's really not that much there. What did you think about this, Peter?
It's interesting because when I first tasted this, I wasn't at home, and I tasted it in a really terrible wine glass. And I thought, actually, tasting it again today, I think the challenge of this one, I agree with. This is the only wine initially that I picked up a little bit of oak on, and I think I think you're right. It is the highest amount of newer, and it's the longest. It spends 18 months in oak. But I think it's built to last. I think there's a slight angularity about it, and I think it needs some bottle age. And I had a really interesting illustration of this in general terms recently. There's a particular Pinot Noir producer that I follow because I know the owner's a friend of mine. And I buy the wine every year, and I was away recently for the weekend, and we took some bottles of wine, and I opened an older bottle of this wine, and my wife, who doesn't talk about wine, said, "That's really delicious. I like it much more than the young ones." And I think that's a challenge that New World Pinot Noir producers face, because they're capable of making wines that have upfront fruit and flesh, and they're quite delicious to drink when they're young. People don't tend to age them, and I think just like red Burgundy, I don't want to keep referring back to Burgundy as you point out, but I think that actually it's definitely worth aging better quality Pinot Noirs from New York, and I actually think that's what this wine is trying to do. I think there's definitely a little bit of ambition here. I should say, and I hate to correct you, but this is Southern Valley, so it's up in the hills a little bit, and it's clay. So we're moving away from the gravel. And the key thing about that is, a friend of mine who's a winemaker in Marlborough said to me a few years ago, you wait and see when the new plantings come on stream. And the new plantings are mostly in the hills. So if you're trying to grow Pinot Noir on the gravels that are so successful for aromatic Pinot, you don't get anything with much depth. And I think the clay soils here really help this. If anything, coming back to that question before about regional character, people tell you that Marlborough Pinot has more red fruit, maybe Tamarillo even. Having said that, what did I think? I think I found red fruit. And then I thought, is it just because I figured out it's Marlborough? I did spot this as a New Zealander, but I think this wine just needs a bit more time to really start showing what it's doing. I think there's a really nice spicy character to it. Maybe part of that's from the oak. As soon as I knew what it was after tasting it blind, I thought, oh, yeah, there are red fruits here. So it is Marlborough. Interesting.
And in fairness, the bottle has been open since last night. It's not been refrigerated since last night, and it is far more open today, which bodes well. I just feel it's important to be honest and say what I felt. And on the other hand, I'm in love with the Stargazer. I love its acidity. I love its kind of tenderness. It's like crunch. It's really undeniable structure. And I just must say this is.
I think it's the most seductive of the wines in the lineup. I agree with you. There's a fullness there and a ripeness without being overripe or overbearing. I wrote seductive yet nice crunch. It's vibrant, but there's a subtlety there. As you work the glass, I think you get more layers emerging. There's some balsamic spice. There's that really lovely subtle sous bois underlying character. I think it's actually quite forward and drinkable, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it is possibly the nicest glass to drink today of these wines. Worth talking about Tasmania. You've got just over 2,000 hectares of vines there. And of course, it's an island surrounded by cold water. And in some ways, you could argue it has more in common climatically with New Zealand than it does with mainland Australia. For years, they grew apples in Tasmania. That was a big crop. And vines came relatively late. But it's interesting because, I talked about my experience judging there, and I think Tasmanian wine, Pinot Noir, has come on unbelievably well. I think there's some really delicious examples, which I've certainly given the odd gold medal in the International Wine Challenge to, not least Toll Puddle. But this one's from Coal River. So we're just north of Hobart, so sort of around the side, heading down towards the bottom of the island. And you do have quite a strong oceanic influence here. And it's the Tasman Sea, and it's cold. Never let anyone tell you the Tasman Sea is a balmy thing to swim in. It ain't. This vineyard was planted in 2004. The winemakers New Zealander, maybe that's why we love it. No, I'm not. But it's I think, we're 30 kilometers in the sea, 150 meters of altitude. They use organic practices, but they're not actually certified organic. I agree with you. I think it's a lovely one.
Mm-hmm. And what I must say, when I first traveled to Tassie, I was in search of a fizz, which will surprise no one because I'm a little old bubblehead. But I must say, I would like to draw a parallel between Tassie and England. So initially, there's a wonderful, wonderful old movie from the 70s when the first people were putting vines into Tassie. And they actually planted stuff like Cabernet because they felt, okay. And it took a while for people to realize that, no, this was actually cool climate. So people, like we know, Jan's Tasmania, which was founded as Heemskerk by Louis Roederer. So we know, and I love sparkling wines from Tassie, above all Arras, So I love the fact that this can be such an ideal climate for sparkling wines, but then also for super delicate Pinot Noirs. I think that's just really wonderful. And yeah, as I said, I lay my cards on the table. Perhaps they wanted to seduce me, and they have totally succeeded. And now we have another interesting question from Roy. How important is the color, intensity, and hue for you in the quality of these Pinots? I must say, I am always very happy when I see a translucent wine. So of course, we already know that Pinot Noir as a grape has a very thin skin, which also makes it very susceptible to rot, which makes it, difficult to deal with. It explains all of its delicacy. So I welcome translucency in wine. Always, especially for Pinot. And if I see a Pinot that is opaque, then I think, what's going on here? So that puts me on my, and then of course I taste, and some of them, just from the climate where they're from, think of Russian River, etc., have far more intensity in color, or also from Central, etc. But translucency for me is always something that I welcome. Hue is a different matter.
I think it's worth saying too that winemakers sometimes obsess about color, and the idea that a red wine has to have a deep color is necessary to make it good. I think certainly in the context of Pinot Noir, but actually if you think about it, even a lot of the lo-fi wines that people are loving and drinking these days don't necessarily have a lot of color. And I don't think that by definition that makes them good, although there are some good ones clearly. But I think color is really important but important in the sense not to take it too seriously. But you're right. I think translucency is lovely. Can I just pick up Renee's question about sense of place? and clones, and do all clones of Pinot Noir show the place? I mean, I think that's really interesting. I have to say that when winemakers start to talk about clones, and New World Pinot Noir winemakers do, my eyes tend to glaze over and roll back in my head. They obsess about clones, and I suppose what I would say, I'd refer you back to my comment before at the winemaker from Martinborough, who said that after the vines had some vine age, maybe 10 years, they could start to taste the vineyard block rather than the clones. So I'd say that's obviously you make a selection of clones depending, maybe to do with rootstock, maybe to do with soil, maybe to do with climate. So I think that does make sense. But for example, there's a clone in New Zealand sometimes called the Swiss clone, which is considered to be inferior and only suitable for sparkling wine. And some of the very best New Zealand Pinot Noirs have a good chunk of the Swiss clone. So what does that tell us? It says, I think, that in the end, I'm not saying you should ignore clones as a winemaker or as a viticulturalist, but I think in the end, once you've made that decision, it's about the vineyard.
And unlike Peter, my eyes glaze over when people start talking to me about wine closures, and that I just think, please. On the contrary, my ears pop up when they speak about clones, because I find it one of the most fascinating aspects of viticulture, and of that fact that things were selected for certain traits. And this has been going on for a long time. And I've actually written extensively about this just because I was in a Californian vineyard and I tasted a Pinot Noir that knocked me sideways. I loved it. And then somebody says, oh yes, this is the Swan clone and blah, blah, and Calera. And I thought, oh my God, this is Pinot finding its feet. And isn't it wonderful that we have these expressions and blah, blah. And then I looked into this. And then I learned a lot about why certain clones were selected, where they were selected from, with what aims in mind. And also, then I also learned about the fact that you have genetics, which is what the DNA is, and you have epigenetics, how those genes express themselves in different environments. And this is where you become unstuck. And I would not, unless I know somebody actually has looked into this and knows what the hell they're talking about, I would no longer listen so naively to talk of clones. I would just ask the right questions. And we know, because of this epigenetic response, that you can plant one and the same clone on the same rootstock in different places, and the vines will look different. They might have slightly hairy under leaves, or so the epigenetic response is the response, or is the expression of which genes express themselves in which place. So one and the same thing on the same rootstock can look completely different. So this is a kind of Pandora's box. This is a rabbit hole, and this is one of the things I meant earlier when I said we always want to make causal connections between here is this clone and this is what I taste. But it's not a straight line. Of course, it has an effect, but that line is never straight. That line is a kind of, I recently somebody tried to explain to me relativity and how black holes have different vibrations and blah, blah. And I think making causal connections between clones and what we taste in the glass, unless we have clinically run trials, is just really difficult, just because of all the other things that come in. Sorry, end of my sermon. I find clones fascinating, but it is a very, very difficult thing to follow and to make connections. And I actually think what happens now with clonal research is also very interesting. About I think there's a huge cult about 777. I must say I'm very taken with the Able clone in New Zealand, or NV6 in Australia. I love these stories. But gosh, it is a rabbit hole.
I mean, I think Anne makes a very good point. I think if you're lucky enough to spend time with winemakers and they talk about what they do, I think there's a lot of stuff that's to do with belief. It's a bit like biodynamics. Personally, I struggle with many aspects of biodynamics, but ultimately, I quite like what it seems to do. And I always remember Olivier Humbres saying, I can't tell you if doing this at this time, according to the biodynamic calendar, works. He said, but it looks like it does. And that's good enough for me. And so I think sometimes people, winemakers who are very enthusiastic, they'll tell you all these things and they think that's the truth. And it may be the truth, but possibly it's their truth. And it's fine. It helps. Maybe it helps us understand, but I don't think we have to take it as gospel and say that's the only truth. I took some people to Tuscany once, and we went to see two very good but very different winemakers, and they were talking about making Chianti Classico, and that was almost completely opposite what they were saying, and yet they clearly both made good wines, and so the truth is their truth, and so the facts can help you, but they shouldn't define. At the end of the day, what's in the glass. This is what we're tasting. This is the point of the exercise. So whatever Anne and I say, you can think we're full of nonsense. Although we've got some very enthusiastic comments. Thank you, Christine and Peter. But the truth is, at the end of the day, what's in the glass? What does it taste like? What does it do for you? And the rest is background. Okay, Anne.
So,
are you going to lead on the last pair?
Yes, but I have to quickly go back and say, in fairness, I was about to pour the last pair, and I stuck my nose again in the dog point, and more and more and more is coming. So, which absolutely proves your theory that this is one for the long run. So, because now there's licorice, there's not just smoke, there's just lovely. And now I am just so excited that we have the Moonlight race by Cottage. And so we have Central Otago in Cottage vis-a-vis the Mornington Peninsula. And we have a lovely contrast because we are in Central. We are 130 kilometers from the sea, and in Coolart Road Vineyard, we are 4 kilometers from the sea. I love that. And I must say, I have a weakness for Central because I worked vintage there in 2009 at Felton. And in 2009, people were still picking later. Lots of people. There was one particular buzzword around at the time, which was hang time. Sort of a hangover from trying to make Pinot into a more powerful wine, as though it had to prove itself next to all of the Cabernets of the world. And that has changed. And I think it has totally changed in this wine. But the beauty of it is that it is absolutely gorgeous central fruit. It's the fruitiest wine, but it's not just upfront fruit. And one of the things that to me, like sometimes when you speak to winemakers and they speak casually, they're not even trying to make a great statement. But these things that are just said without much thinking give a lot away. And I'm thinking of Andrew Donaldson, owner of Akitu in Central, on near Mount Barker, so quite a bit away from here, from Cottage. And he said you cannot avoid fruit in Central Otago. If you've been to Cromwell, you've seen that ridiculously stupid and kitsch papier structure of fruit, where they would, and when I lived there, I lived on a peach orchard. So cherries, Doris plums, apricot, etc., etc. So fruit is a super fruit growing area. Now it's a super wine area that I think has found its feet so well over the past decade. And so Andrew Donaldson said he remembers picking fruit from trees as a child with the juice running down his arm. And I tasted this, and that is what I was reminded of. I myself was once lucky enough, this was actually in England, not in New Zealand, and I've spent my childhood eating and stealing cherries from other people's trees and plums and mirabelles, yes. But I once had the luck of actually eating ripe mulberries from a mature old mulberry tree. And indeed, it was the juice, like blood running down my arm. And so you have an incredible load here of fruit, which I think is incredibly well contained and structured. And then we have single vineyard wine. And because, sorry, the Burn Cottage is from 2 vineyards, the Sauvage vineyard, and then another vineyard in Bannockburn. And Mornington Peninsula, some Coolart vineyard. And I must say, this is just, I actually also think that this is very much for the long term. I wrote, I mean, I taste Pinot and sometimes I'm terrible, especially when I write tasting notes that are not for publication. These are not for publication, these are just so I can talk about these wines. And I wrote sandalwood, subtleness, shimmering aroma. I mean, crisp red fruit, much purity, subtle crunch, poetry. So you see what happens to me if I taste too much Pinot. Very, very easy to just, But I must say, a totally fitting finale for this, and actually impossible to say what is better. I find both of these wines incredibly compelling and beautifully touching. Very, very, very beautiful pair, huh? Sorry, Peter.
No, that's fine. Actually, well, while you were saying that, I was just thinking, last time I was in New Zealand at the Pinot Noir conference, they talked a lot about Turanga Waiwai, and Turanga Waiwai is a New Zealand word, and it means the place where we stand, the place we belong. And I think anywhere outside of France where people make Pinot Noir, they can't help but kind of look over their shoulder at Burgundy. People, it is the benchmark, but I think you shouldn't be trying to make Burgundy in New Zealand or in Australia or in California or in Chile. And so I quite like the way with Turanga Waiwai, they were trying to kind of it's sort of about terroir, but it's sort of about sense of place, saying we're doing our own thing. Now, having said that, tasting this today, tasting the 10 minutes by tractor, I thought, oh, it's a bit Burgundian. and I do try and avoid that kind of reflex to say, oh, it's Burgundian, so that makes it better. But it's in the Larry McKenna, who's a marvelous man, Australian but adopted New Zealander. He makes brilliant wines, but he used to be the winemaker at Martinborough Vineyards, and he had a Pinot Noir that was rejected by the export tasting panel, I think 4 times, because they said it smelt malodorous. In other words, it smelt like Burgundy, and it wasn't Brett. We're not talking Brett here. We're talking a bit funky and maybe a little bit herbaceous and a bit sous-bois and so on. Anyway, Larry's a very sort of down-to-earth guy, but it did make me laugh that at the time they didn't like that. They didn't think that was an appropriate style to be allowed to be exported. These days, as we've talked about, Anne's talked about fruit quality, and I said absolutely, I think fruit's a given, and now I think we're beginning to see more complexity, more texture, slightly taking the fruit for granted, so you don't have to push for it. And so it was interesting because when I tasted this over the weekend, and I did it blind, but I was with a friend, and she's not a wine person, and she went, "It's got more," and I went, "What do you mean?" And she couldn't, and so we talked about it, and in a way, and then she said it's more mineral, and I guess to me, minerality in wine, it's a very vexing word, and something people think we shouldn't be talking about minerality, but I think minerality is often to do with texture, and I think that maybe that's what this wine has. I think this is a really brilliant pairing, actually. Just coming back to the Burn Cottage. Thing about Central Otago is it's the nearest New Zealand gets to a continental climate because it's the furthest. It's 130 kilometers from the sea. That's in New Zealand terms, that's a long way from the sea, and it's more or less surrounded by mountains. And so, you know, if you think about it, in some ways, Burgundy is a continental wine. There isn't really a lot of maritime influence going on there. So I think that's really, really interesting. In terms of, I talked about sort of sub-regional differences. This Burn Cottage comes from two vineyards. They're Home Vineyard and Sauvage Vineyard. And this is Pisa Range. And it's the other side of the river. You can see that big lake. You can see that big lake there in the sort of center right of the, yep, there. And you can see Lowburn. And that along that side of that used to be a river. Now it's a lake. They dammed it for hydropower, and they flooded amazing apricot orchards as it happens. But we've forgotten about that now. But the Pisa Range, those mountains running more or less north-south on to the left of that, and you get a lot of cold air comes down off there. So it can be a little bit frost-driven, but it's probably it is overall a cooler, fresher area, let's say, than Bannockburn to the south and Bendigo over on the right to the east there. So Pisa's really quite interesting, I think. And they'll tell you that the wines, the characteristic is that the wines are seductive. This only had 5% whole bunch, and in fact, the 10 minutes by tract only had 15% whole bunch. So not as much, you know, whole bunch is a super fashionable thing for people to talk about. The truth is, in New Zealand, and I'd say in Australia as well, because we're talking cool sites, you can't do too much whole bunch if you don't have lignified stems. So you need stem ripeness. Otherwise, you pick up too much greenness, and greenness is obviously a crime when it comes to red wine. For me, as I said earlier, right at the beginning, the correct thing is herbaceousness. So a little bit of that, and some of that maybe comes from the stems, but you've got to be really, really careful with that percentage of whole bunch in a blend. And this case, both are quite low, I think. I want to address a question from someone who asked about value for money. I've lost it now, but compared to Burgundy, and I have to say, value for money is a tricky concept, because too often we think that value for money means cheap, and clearly we're not talking cheap with Pinot Noir. We're not talking about cheap with Pinot Noir from New Zealand or Australia. So I would argue that really top quality Burgundy is mostly stratospherically priced, and normal people like us can't even afford to drink it. And I think so. New Zealand and Australia are sort of stepping into that middle ground, not necessarily the bottom end. Although, to be honest, I would rather drink Pinot Noir from New Zealand or Australia than cheap red Burgundy, which I think is often pretty filthy. So I think these are not necessarily everyday wines. You know, some of these are, where are we? I think 45, 50 quid as we go. Yeah, so the 10 minutes by tract was £60. Sorry, the UK currency, and the Burn Cottage is 42. So that's a bargain. But you know, that's not, those prices are not everyday prices for most people. But if you like to drink Burgundy, there's not much to be drunk at that price. So I think there is value for money. Anne's nodding. I like it when she agrees with me.
Yeah, because it happened, as tragic things happened to me in my life when the merchant that I bought Burgundy from told me I just couldn't have anymore because I'm not buying enough, and the allocation just doesn't stretch to people like me who don't spend enough money. So I thought that was probably a sign from the universe, you know, and I completely agree with you, Peter. Notwithstanding that, there is a lot of pleasure to be had in that from Pinot, from Australia and New Zealand, in that bracket between 10 and 20. A lot of pleasure to be had. But then if you move into that price class, I mean, what you get is, I mean, just going back and forth between those two glasses, isn't it just absolute joy? Is there not so much to discover when you actually really interact with the wine? And you know, there is you get your value for your money there. And I also believe that these wines age, you can lay them down. You never have to worry about cork taint because they're screw caps. I must say they prove a point, don't they? And again, for places that have a kind of a 30-year history, and then there is
I think there's a really
program. Sorry,
it's a
Peter.
really good question from Katie Exton about the friendly rivalry between New Zealand and Oz, and the tagline for this tasting was "and to be an attitude," and it's a really good question. What are the things that unite New Zealand and Australia? And the truth is we do a little thing, but basically we like each other, we respect each other, and in fact there's a remarkable amount of interchange. So for example, Anne was talking about Akitu. Well, I think the winemaker there is a Kiwi who mostly works in Australia.
Exactly.
The Stargazer is Sarah Connor, who's a Kiwi but has worked in Australia for a long time. I mentioned Larry McKenna, Australian, who's lived in New Zealand for decades. So I think there's a genuine mutual respect and interaction. I would say, actually, joking aside, they're not parochial. I think Pinot Noir, perhaps more than any other wine style, there's a commonality of purpose, and people are looking to make great wines. So I think that's, I think, and step change. I think Pinot's so different to other grapes. Australia's sort of made its reputation on big, substantial red wines, obviously Shiraz, but also Cabernet, and really great wines. By and large, New Zealand can't make red wines like that. There are some pretty good Bordeaux blends, but it's a small group, and they are definitely at the more middleweight style. So they're quite different compared to what you can do in Australia. And there's a tiny amount of, I think, extraordinarily good cool climate Syrah, but it's not Shiraz. It's almost like a different grape. So I think with Pinot, there's a kind of fellow feeling. I think people get on. People who make Pinot love it, and they love to be challenged, and they love to challenge the people they work with. So I think there is probably more than any other wine style, I'd say, Pinot unites Australian and New Zealand winemakers.
And I think it actually goes much further than that, because even like an eternity ago, like in 2009, when I was harvesting at Felton, it was like having the United Nations on the vineyard. And there were actually lots of youngsters from European vineyards who were, the wonderful thing is Northern Southern Hemisphere, you can actually come out in spring and work harvest elsewhere. And for our current generation of winemakers, no matter where they're from, they have harvested elsewhere. They have a real exchange. And there's always, I've brought a bottle from here. There's a huge curiosity and a huge interchange. There is an exchange program where viticulturists from Central get to work in Burgundy and vice versa. There are lots of these programs. And I think there is a kind of a global Pinot community, and they all like to taste and drink each other's wines, and they all like to see each other's vineyards, find out about this, because let's face it, the people who are drawn to making this sort of wine are after something that is kind of metaphysical, just that goes beyond just, and that's what attracts me to Pinot. And I must say, but let's quickly, because we have another 11 minutes, so let's quickly look.
I'm going to give you one question, the one from Davide Bortone. But just first, I want to answer Karen's point about low percentage of whole bunch. It's absolutely about the challenge to ripen. You need wood ripeness, you need lignification, and otherwise you just get bitterness and greenness. So I think lots of people love the idea of whole bunch, but you have to be very, very careful. Last time I was in New Zealand, there was a winemaker whose name I'm now going to forget in Central Otago, who had just a particular parcel of fruit that was really good quality, and they made a 100% whole bunch. And they also did one that was 0 whole bunch, and it was just lucky enough for us that happened to work out that way. And it was really interesting to taste the difference. But they said it wasn't something that they would normally ever consider, but it just was that parcel of fruit had the ripeness in the stems, and they could do it. And again, I come back to my comment about Goldilocks grape. Pinot Noir doesn't like to be too cold, and it doesn't like to be too hot. So you're always going to be pushing the boundaries of ripeness, trying to get it right. Oh, and just one point actually that makes me think. Grant Taylor, who makes excellent wine in Central Otago, I was sort of full of. He doesn't make wine in Bannockburn, and I was full of the joys of Bannockburn, and he was talking about Gibson. He said, the thing about Gibson is, because I was saying, well, Gibson's a bit unfashionable. He said, yes, he said, but when we get it ripe, we get it right. And so maybe not every year, but Gibson is right on the edge of being warm enough to ripen Pinot. So when they get it right, it's amazing. Whereas Bannockburn arguably gets it right more often, but maybe some years a little bit too warm. So I think ripeness is absolutely key. So, and Davide's question, I think, is absolutely up your street.
And I see another question by Susuna Nita. Like, I hear so many people talk about burnt cottage. What makes this winery so special? Now, this was land bought by the Sauvage family, who own wineries. They also own Köhler Ruprecht in Germany. And I remember driving up there at the end of one harvest day, up into the Pisa, range, a windy little road. And what do I find? A little farm. And the guy who's taking care of it is just trying to coop all the chickens back into their coop, and it's a kind of enchanted place, because you feel very remote, and these people have always made their own biodynamic preparations. So there was a little shed with all the biodynamic preparations. There's this whole farm thing going on, this holistic thing. And somehow there is, and I'm not a new age kind of girl, but there is an energy in these wines and an energy in that place, and you feel it. And I know this sounds totally unscientific and stupid, but nonetheless, there are wines that have real personalities. Both of these do. And my abiding memory is of Burn Cottage, of being up there, seeing bunches of herbs hung up in a little shed, and actually really trying to get the last few chickens into that coop for the night, so they wouldn't be eaten by stoats or foxes or whatever. And so there are some enchanted places, and I think Burn Cottage is one of them.
And that actually does bring up that point that we can't be entirely objective about wines. The truth is there can be an emotional reaction, an emotional response to wines, and part of it is context. Part of it is knowing where it's made and what it does. And I'm unashamedly not embarrassed by that.
No.
I have hand on heart favorite producers who I love, and I've happened to given them gold medals in a competition, which makes me feel good about my tasting ability. But actually, the truth is, I like those wines because I know the people who make them.
Exactly.
And I know where they come from. So I think there's no denying that.
Mm-hmm.
But now you have to answer Davide's question, because I think it's a really good one.
Okay, let me read it. I find that stylistically, almost all the wines presented are a good reflection of their respective terroir. Comparing them to European wines, I find most of the wines tasted closer to the German style, particularly the R, than the French Burgundy. I've just returned from a tour in the R, and I find the comparison holds up, especially the care not to cover the varietal with new wood. The difference on modern Pinot is made by the climate and the skill and attention of the winemakers on the harvest time of the grapes. So I agree with you. Harvest point is another one of those key things of that sea change, when people no longer fetishize ripeness for ripeness sake and then try and extract the hell out of it. So I think harvest point is a key decision, especially for grapes like Pinot Noir. And what Peter was just saying about Gibston Valley vis-a-vis Bannockburn sub-regions of Central Otago, Pinot is one of those things that is hard to ripen in climates that are marginal for Pinot. Yet when they get it right, it gives you that heartbreak of the heartbreak grape, because it's kind of totally seductive. And so in the R now, it is easy to ripen Pinot, but again, a bit like Central, the R has really changed its tune, because you've been there, you've seen steep slopes that look like Mosel slopes of black slate. And boy, do these get hot. It's easy to clock up. It's far easier to clock up 14.5% in your Pinot than to make a tender Pinot. Yet there are people who have totally clocked onto this and who are now making very tender and graceful Pinot. So, yeah. And again, the R is one of the most northerly wine regions. I mean, the most northerly are Saxony and Saale Unstrut, but then you have the R above the 50th degree of latitude, where it really, used to be critical, but now you have you still have south-facing slopes with black slate that warms up. So you can absolutely ripen grapes in every vintage there now. Now the challenge is different. And I think the comparable thing about really tuning into what Pinot is and should be in the R is very similar to what's happened in Central Otago, where you couldn't really, where you can really ripen beautiful Pinot. And then you have to see what you do with the ripeness, or what you want to see in your fruit. Now, saying German styles, if we look how tiny Burgundy is, and now people say this is Burgundian. Now, I have tasted 100% whole bunch, tender, gorgeous, translucent stuff from Volney. And I've tasted absolutely glossy, inky stuff from, I don't know, somewhere in some Grand Cru in the Côte de Nuit. So what is Burgundy? Because we have a vast spectrum of styles in Burgundy, and a vast spectrum of aspects, despite the fact that this is a tiny stretch of a limestone escarpment. Then I take you to Germany, where we have 4 degrees of latitude, and not only have we got limestone, we've got sandstone, slate, löss, loam, quartzite, you name it. I shy back from making these comparisons, just because wouldn't it be beautiful if it were so easy? But sadly it isn't, and happily it isn't. So I know I'm not answering your question, because it is not a question that can be answered. And if you are trying to pass exams, do I know what you're talking about? Do I know how beautiful it would be to have a straight answer? But I'm afraid there are no straight answers. Sorry.
We've got 3 minutes left, and actually, I think that leads right into some questions we were sent in advance, and the one that I want maybe Anne sort of partially answer, but it says it's hard to generalize. But is it possible to make statements of key differences in the styles and winemaking of Pinot Noir in Australia versus New Zealand? Also, what makes each distinct from other premium areas such as Burgundy, Germany, USA? If I can go first in 30 seconds, I would say you can't. I think it's more about modern Pinot Noir winemaking. And so I think there are more similarities than differences. I think in terms of regionality, I think we can see evidence of terroir, climate and so on, but I'm not sure they define the wines, because as Anne and I found doing them blind, you don't always know what they are. But I don't think that negates the idea of terroir. I think that there are choices that winemakers make in response to the individual vintage, but also the long-running terroir and so on. And that's where you end up. So I don't think you can say that, but Anne might disagree with me. She might agree with me.
No, I think it is just so difficult. It is, like what I must say is a very, very beautiful thing here is that we actually get Pinot-ness. We get the true nature of Pinot in numerous facets. We tasted 8 wines that were all very different. We could taste another 80 wines and they'd be different. But if they're well made, I've actually got something that I call Pinot-ness about them. And I want to return to just one question by Sudi, saying interesting conversation. but wines to recommend at a lower price. I think the purpose here was to show very different levels of Pinot that have a sense of place, because all of the Pinots that you can get in the UK that are from, that retail around £10 or in that 10 and 15 pound range, they are actually blends, mostly regional blends, and they have to be in order to reach that price. And I think it is for that reason that we couldn't really include them, because there was a point to comparing these places. Hence, the very nature of the exercise cuts out a certain level of value Pinot which exists. There are great value Pinots, but we couldn't have played this game with them in that same fashion. I hope that answers the question. And let's see if there are any other.
I think we have to go, actually. Can I say, what a fantastic audience. We've had some really brilliant feedback, some really good questions. The only other thing I have to say is you will be getting a survey by email, having attended, and we'd be really grateful if you could respond to that. But on behalf of Anne and myself, Australian and New Zealand Winegrowers, thank you very much for attending. Have a great day.
Salute tutti, and thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye.